Hi and welcome back. I've been living as a slow traveler in Antalya for the last month, and today I'm going to break down all of the costs that I incurred for the 28-day stay that I had, and I'll also talk a little bit about some of the pros and cons and whether or not I could see myself living or staying in Antalya for a more extended period of time. In my last videos of the series, I went over my first impressions and talked a little bit about how to get here, how to get around, some of the safety issues, accessibility, and things like that. And I also gave a breakdown of how much individual things cost, like groceries and dining out and whatnot. So if you haven't seen that, I'll link it here. I also did another video about some of the things to do around Antalya, both in and around Antalya, as well as some of the foods that I think you have to try if you do come to Türkiye or Antalya specifically. I'll link that video here if you haven't seen it yet. If you're new here, my name's Kira, and over the last 25 years, I've been to almost 60 countries, and last year I retired early to travel the world full-time. I love talking about travel, and especially looking at videos and things about the cost of travel in specific areas, and so hopefully this is helpful to you, but if you have any questions at all, don't hesitate to ask. All right, let's get started. So first of all, how much did 28 days in Antalya cost? The first thing I always like to talk about is accommodation. That's usually one of the most expensive parts of the travel. For me, I rented an Airbnb for 28 days. It was a 1-bedroom with a wash machine, kitchen, air conditioning, and television and internet, of course. Those are always the boxes that I check. And I try to find things that are under $1,000, but unfortunately that's been a little difficult for some places. And with the recent inflation in Türkiye, that was especially difficult. I actually decided to stay 1 month in Antalya instead of Fethiye because Fethiye was even more expensive than Antalya. But the total accommodation cost for Antalya for 28 days was $1,273. This breaks down to just over $45 a day, which isn't that bad, but like I said, it has gone up a lot over the last few years, and so you used to be able to get a lot better deal for a 1-month stay. There are a lot of restrictions on Airbnb now, or long-term stays in general, and so there are fewer of them, so you're going to find that it's a little bit harder to get a more affordable place. However, you can stay in a pension or an hotel, and those are often cheaper. So if you look on booking.com, you can find ones for $20 to $30 a night, depending on where you're staying and what amenities it has. However, that might not have a full kitchen. You might just have like a kettle and a refrigerator or something like that. So it really depends kind of on how long you're staying, but you can get a lot cheaper hotel, which is called an hotel in Türkiye. It just really depends on what you need. Also, if you're the kind of person that likes to eat out a lot, you may not need a full kitchen. Personally, I like to cook in, and you'll see in a minute that I spend very little eating out. But I'll go over that in a second. Actually, I'll go over it right now. So for dining out, I actually only spent $34. I know, that sounds low, and it is, but I actually was planning on doing some hiking after staying in Antalya, and I knew I was going to be on the road, basically eating out every day or getting groceries every day, and that was going to drive my costs up. Plus, I was going to get a chance to try all the Turkish food that I wanted, and so I didn't really focus on dining out while I was in Antalya. But I know this is not the case for most people, so I've kind of come up with a little bit of an idea of what you might spend if you're someone who likes to dine out a lot more. Basically, the price of coffee, if you're going to a semi-fancy coffee shop, and I'm only getting an Americano, which is essentially just plain coffee, and so that's a little bit cheaper than maybe a latte or whatnot, but I was spending approximately $3.20 roughly per coffee. So if you were somebody that likes to go out for coffee every day, let's just say you might spend about $88 for a 28-day stay. So for lunch, if you're a person that, let's say, wants to go to lunch 3 times a week, you can get lunch out if you're willing to not go in the very, very touristy areas. You can get lunch for about $7 to $8. And so if you were going to go out to lunch 3 times a week, that would cost you about $88 as well. Now dinner's kind of where it varies a lot. If you're willing to go get like a doner or a pita or something like that, you can easily spend like $10 to $15. But if you want to have a sit-down meal, you might spend something like $20 to $30. So that really depends kind of on what your preference is, if you want fancy. But let's just say you're basically spending about 1,000 Turkish lira per meal, which would be roughly $26 per meal. And you want to go out 3 times a week for dinner, that's going to cost you an additional $314. So all in all, if you go out for coffee every day, 3 times a week for lunch, 3 times a week for dinner, that's going to run you about $491. So stick around to the end because I'll add that into the total so you can have a better idea of what you might spend if you were going to spend something like that. All right, let's talk about entertainment. For entertainment, there are a ton of tours you can do, and I did one specific tour, which was to Pamukkale in Hierapolis, and that one was just under $80 in total. You have to pay for the Get Your Guide tour part, which is around $40, let's just say. And then the entrance into the site is another $40, so it was roughly about $80. So I also did a walking tour, so all in all, my accommodation was $83 total. Once again, if you wanted to do one excursion per week, then you would maybe say you might pay about $80, depending on what it is. They run from like $15 to $80. It really depends on what it is. And so you might spend $80 a week. So you could easily add another $200, $250, depending on what you decide to do. Just be aware that a lot of the Get Your Guide prices do not include entrance fees. So make sure you read the fine print. I even saw a paddleboarding excursion where it was $16 for 4 hours. And I thought, wow, that's great. Why not do that? And then I read the fine print and he actually wanted like $200 in cash on demand. So just read the fine print. I've noticed a lot of the museums or sites, ruins, things like that, you may still have to pay separately for the entrance fee for that. The next category is fixed, and this is my health insurance, phone, credit card fees, subscriptions, and internet security, cloud-based storage, things like that. I prorate this out to a daily cost, and all in all, that came to $169. Some of the big ones were health insurance, which for 28 days was $69. And then I know a lot of people are curious about phone. For now, my phone is actually $0. This is because I have Google Fi still. I know they're gonna fire me at some point, but they haven't fired me yet. And I also have a bunch of credits. So I'm basically using it to use up the credits until they fire me, and then I will figure something else out at that point. But for now, my phone is $0. However, if you do have Google Fi and you're thinking of traveling, I think they give you 90 days before they shut you off. And basically, you're going to still pay the same like $10 per gig that you would normally pay. So you can take that into consideration for the first few months at least. The next category is groceries. And for groceries, I spent $122. This included 16 different trips to the grocery store. And I do include the Friday market in that. So I went 4 times in my 28 days to the Friday market. But I also went to the grocery store another 12 times on top of that. You may think this is also inexpensive, and it is, but I didn't really buy any meat. So I essentially was basically vegetarian while I was in Antalya, not for any reason, but just because I was really enjoying the fresh produce, and so I often would just have a salad for dinner. I would have eggs for breakfast and a salad for dinner, and maybe a side of rice and beans or something like that. But I really just kind of ate quite simply and just ate whatever was fresh. If you are going to buy meat, it's actually quite affordable. For example, I think you can get a pound of chicken for a few dollars, so it's not really very expensive. They also have a lot of local butchers, so you don't need to buy it at the grocery store. And like I mentioned in my last video, at the Friday market, or mine was a Friday market, but at the normal weekly market, you can buy fish and meat and stuff like that there too. So that's going to be your best bang for your buck probably. The next category is shopping, and for this, it really was just toiletries, and I spent $12. This was sunscreen, feminine products, and I think that's it. Oh, toothpaste. The next category is transportation. For transportation, I spent $9. I flew into Antalya, so I'm not including that because that'll be on my yearly roundup. And the tram and bus cost 33 lira, which is roughly about 89 cents. And basically, I just walked everywhere anyway. I did take the tram a couple of times to get a little bit further out and from the airport, for example, but it's really affordable, plus it's really easy to walk around to most places. All in all, for everything, I spent $1,701, which for 28 days comes out to about $61 per day. So, yay! I actually am under budget this time, but just like I said, I do want to add if you were going to eat out a lot more, and I want to add if you were going to do an excursion once a week. So let me break that down. If you were going to eat out, like I said, 28 coffees, 12 dinners, 12 lunches. That would bring your daily total up to $77 a day. And if you were going to have one extra excursion per week, that would bring your total up to $86 a day. So even with that, it's still pretty affordable, surprisingly, because I know that the inflation was a big issue. And I know that when I was looking at accommodation, I was quite surprised at how expensive it was. And so I really was a little bit wary of this portion of my trip because I wasn't sure how it was going to go. But groceries tend to be fairly inexpensive. And then, of course, like I said, I found lots of things to do within walking distance. So let me talk about a few of the pros and cons, and then I'll let you know whether or not I think I could stay longer than a month. So Antalya is a city of around 1 million people. I believe it's a little over 1 million people, but it doesn't feel as busy as, let's say, Istanbul. So even though you're in the middle of the city where I stayed in the main area, it doesn't feel busy. My street was quiet. I mean, definitely you could hear some people from time to time, but it wasn't like super, super busy or overwhelming at all. So that's a pro. I think that you can be in a place that has lots of opportunities to do things, is in a beautiful setting, is easy to get to other places as far as flights and buses and things like that go, yet you don't feel like you're just constantly being swamped with people. I would go for a run in the morning, and along the promenade, the Turkish people don't seem to get up super early. And when I say that, I mean like I could go at 8 or 8:30 and it still wasn't super busy. So I usually try to beat the crowd by going really early, but I didn't really need to do that much. So that was a pro for me. However, side note for that, I was in Antalya in April, and so that's not the high season. So I have no idea what it would be like if you're there in July or August. It may be a completely different story. Also, it is quite hot in those months. Some other pros, like I said, close to the water, that's definitely a must or a plus. It is easy to walk around. There's biking opportunities, and you have a great view of the mountains. I mean, the setting could not be more beautiful. You can also get to hiking via public transportation, and you can bike straight from town into the mountains, essentially. The Turkish people are very nice. That's definitely a pro. Sure, sometimes they're trying to sell you something if you're in the main touristy area, but if you stay out of that area, you'll find that that diminishes a lot. Like I said, some items are quite affordable, like produce, and it's very fresh and delicious as well. So that's a definite pro. The expat group was very nice as well, and then there's side groups with hiking and other things. If you like to party, there's definitely a lot of groups that will go out and party. There's boat trips that go out and party. There's nightclubs. I mean, if that's your thing, that's definitely available. That's not really my thing. But I did find that the expat group was very willing to help if I had questions. And like I said, there's side groups that do other things, and they were easy to join, and everyone was very welcoming. English is pretty easy to get around with. Of course, if you get out of the touristy area, you might find that's not as much the case, but if you're going to stay in the touristy areas, you will have no problems whatsoever. And like I said, the people are very nice. So even if you're just pointing at vegetables and grunting, and I really found them very friendly and helpful. As a solo female, I felt quite safe, and I even arrived in town at about 11 p.m., took the tram from the airport, walked to my apartment, didn't feel unsafe at all, even with all my luggage and everything. I also went to the beach alone and coffee and whatnot and didn't feel uncomfortable at all. And I took the local transportation with no issues. Some cons are that it still feels like there's some things that aren't quite up to par. Let me give you some examples. The internet, for instance, is very slow and often just stalls out. And it's not just the place that I stayed. I actually went to a coffee shop and I checked the speed test and it seemed like it was a little bit better. But their upload speeds are very slow. And for me, especially with having to upload videos into the cloud and then into YouTube, this was actually quite a problem. So just be aware that the internet is not going to be maybe as fast or as reliable as they're used to. Also, some things are very expensive. For example, electronics, sunscreen, alcohol. I know some of these are just touristy things, so the price is bumped up, but I think alcohol is actually taxed a lot higher than in some countries, and so the price of alcohol is a little bit more expensive. I also heard from some of the expats that if you're planning on staying a while, there's actually a lot of rules around having your own personal items. So for instance, your phone has to be changed and your car, or maybe if you keep it, it's just very expensive. I'm not exactly sure of the ins and outs of that, but if you were considering staying a longer term, you may want to look into that kind of thing. This obviously won't pertain to everybody, but I was planning on hiking the Lycian Way, And I thought that I didn't want to carry my tent or my sleeping bag around all the time, so I would just buy it when I was there. And I figured it's a big city, it's close to a hiking trail, what would be the issue? Well, they didn't really have any stores that have any good brands that I could find. Maybe I didn't look in the right place, but it was hard for me to find good quality items. And along the trail, I actually needed to buy shoes, and it was the same thing. Of course, in that case, I was in a smaller town, so that's not as crazy. But being in a town like Antalya with 1 million people, I would have thought there would have been more options for some of the higher end brands. In addition, there are still some scams, and you can often feel like you're getting ripped off. For example, many of the ATMs charge anywhere from 8 to 20% on top of the amount that you take out. And then there are scams in restaurants where they change out the menu after you've already ordered. And so you may want to take a picture of the menu so you can prove that that was the price. And then there's the taxi scam where they pretend that their meter isn't working and then they overcharge you. And of course, you're already in the car and you can't really, or you feel like you can't really do anything about it. So that always makes you feel a little bit wary. In addition, like I mentioned, with the tours, there's often extra fees on top of whatever the price is. And that just kind of puts me on edge a little bit. And so that's just, to me, that's a con. I'd rather just know the whole thing going in. The other thing is people still smoke everywhere, including in restaurants. And actually, as I'm filming this right now, I can smell that somebody is smoking in one of their rooms, which these are non-smoking rooms, yet people are still smoking. So there is a lot of cigarettes still in Türkiye. And if you don't like smoking, that may be a con. A couple other things which may bug you or not, depending on your preference, but people and buses are often late. So if that's something that bothers you, may not be the place for you. But could I live here? So I think I could come and stay a little bit longer, but I think I'm realizing that I'm not really a long-term beach person. So as much as I do like the beach, I don't really just want to spend the day on the beach every day. So I do like Antalya because there are mountains and hiking and biking and other activities available, and the expat group is very friendly. So those are some reasons I would probably come back for a longer time, but I would definitely need to make sure that maybe I had a bike or something like that so that I could get out and get away from the beach, and especially if it's a high season, because I don't really like places that are super, super touristy either. So I guess my answer is maybe. Okay, so now I've gone over all the costs and talked about whether or not I would go back to Antalya for a longer period of time. But now you tell me, have you ever been to this part of Türkiye? And if so, what did you think? Did you think things were expensive? Did you like the area? I'd love to hear from you. Once again, thank you for watching and happy travels.